Cool, man. I am here with Mr. Jay Burton once again. It's good to have you back, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me back on. I really enjoyed our last conversation, so I'm excited to talk to you again.
Yeah, you know, I've been going through like the whole idea of our broader culture at large. My kids are probably closer to your age than I am. I'm 46, but my youngest is 20 and my oldest is 27. So you're probably right in that time frame
Yeah,
there.
yeah. I'm 26, so I'm a little bit younger than your oldest.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So but you're of the same generation as them. And yeah, I mean, you can really relate to the things that they're going through. And I find it strange whenever I look, and maybe we'll start here. Have you heard of this Raja Jackson thing?
Yeah, I have. So I'm relative to my age, kind of an old school fight fan. Like grew up during the age when his dad was like a very iconic fighter, right?
Hmm.
Rampage Jackson. His Pride run was great. So was his UFC run, albeit a little bit shorter. Just really fun fighter, right? I probably the most iconic moment is he's in a triangle choke, right? And Quentin, nicknamed Rampage Jackson, has got his arms stretched out. And normally that's a bad position. And this guy was so strong, so explosive that he basically did a combination curl and deadlift, brought this dude up into the air, slammed him, knocked him out cold. Great, like
Right.
all time iconic moment. And yeah, Jackson was infamous for his hot temper, right? There's a GIF you've probably seen of a guy just breaking a door in half. That was
Yeah, that was
Rampage
that was
Jackson.
the Ultimate Fighter with him and Rashad Evans.
Yeah, 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 which is honestly funny television, right? Like
Yes, it was hilarious.
Quentin's a funny dude. Whereas Raja, his son, I don't know anything really about him personally. I know that Rampage has sort of reinvented himself as a media figure. He has a podcast that some people listen to. I've probably caught an episode here or there. And the most recent, I guess, kind of instantiation of that was becoming what they call an IRL streamer, right? Someone who basically just walks around with a phone, streams what they're doing, to an audience. And, Raja, Rampage's son, is sort of an aspiring fighter. I don't know if he's any good or not. But for context, right, for those who aren't aware of this, Raja was supposed to go to a local wrestling show, right? Kind of obviously professional wrestling. It's all fake. And effectively, he was supposed to have a match with this guy, goes by the name, I don't remember his Christian name, but Psycho Stu. And they're doing a sort of like a hype building thing, right? They're trash talking each other, and Stu comes up and basically spikes a beer off his head. Obviously it hurt, but wrestling hurts. But it's for show, right? And you can see Raja get a little bit angered by this. They seem to kind of make up, but during the show, he's sitting there talking to the people in the live chat, and they're egging him on. And to kind of move through this quickly, he jumps the ring, slams Stu, and it seems like the guy didn't fight back at first. He was supposed to come into the ring anyway. All right, this is what's supposed to happen in the match. Knocks him out, and then when he's knocked out, legitimately, not for show, he hits him 22 times,
Mhm.
already unconscious. Basically, attempted murder, messes his face all up. It seems as if the guy is conscious and awake now, uh, which is good. I mean, he's messed up from all the reporting I've heard on it. But yeah, man, it was a disturbing event. Even if you're not necessarily, like a fight fan, right? It kind of jumped containment into wider culture. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that's sort of the executive summary of the event.
So what I was looking at, I mean, I keep up with MMA media. I'm a big MMA fan. My son and I just went and saw Dustin Poirier's retirement fight in New Orleans
Nice.
in July, and so I'm a huge fight fan. I've been watching UFC since UFC two. Like
Mm.
I'm like old school fan, and so I know Rampage really well. Raja is an amateur. Well, he was an amateur fighter. He was 4-0 as an amateur, and he just went pro, and he lost his first pro bout. And last week he got a concussion. He was in practice, and one of his sparring partners pulled a spinning wheel kick, caught him in the side of the head, almost knocked him out. Luckily, he was a smaller guy. I think Raja fights at 170, and this guy fights at 135. But still, I mean, good technique. Caught him with the heel, like wobbled him a bit. So he was already on concussion protocol, and shouldn't have had anything to do with this wrestling event, period, whatsoever. And from what I could tell, it looked like he didn't expect to be involved in it. Apparently, you seem to have seen most of the videos. So the wrestler with the cowboy hat, AJ something, had invited Raja, and he has some sort of beef with Psycho Stu, and he told Psycho Stu to do this to Raja in order to get Raja pissed off at him. And then he egged Raja on to go into the ring and get his receipt, right? Which means like you got sucker punched, you sucker punch him once, you're all good as far as wrestling terms goes. From what I can tell, that's what it means. It's like, yeah, you get a hit on him, you're gonna get yours, and everything's cool after that. So Raja already had it in his mind. I get to go hit this guy. And then, like you said, in the chat, they start egging him on. They start calling him a bitch, telling him he's a pussy. How dare you let him get away with that? And then he's like, all right, if you give me 50 subs, I'll I'll knock him out. And then he got his 50 subs and he goes, all right, I'm going to knock him out. And then a bunch of people started egging him on even more, saying, oh, okay, if you really knock him out, I'll sub. If you knock him out, I'll sub. If you knock him out, I'll sub. So we talk a lot about the attention economy. And that's basically what he's cashing in on. The more views he gets, the more money that Kick is going to promote him for as far as ads, whatever goes. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, this is such an unhealthy way to live where your entire life, like we all know reality TV as it was on television, wasn't reality. There was a lot of it that was scripted. There were all kinds of things going on. But it's kind of like fed into this IRL streaming, these streamers that go around like Sneeko that are constantly streaming themselves, putting themselves in very bad situations, like when Sneeko went in there to spar Sean Strickland. Well, if you know who Sean Strickland is, you don't go in there and put your head in the way of his fist because he's going to hit you and he's going to hit you hard, especially if you're not a respected fighter. See, Sean Strickland's thing is if you're a respected fighter, you come into my octagon, we'll have a nice sparring session. But if you're just some street dude that thinks he's going to prove a point and you get in my octagon, I'm going to show you the kind of point that's going to be proven, and it's going to be me putting you on your ass, because you're not a badass, you're just some average dude. But you see these guys putting themselves in these bad situations, and I can't help but think that this has a broader context as far as y'all's generation goes and the way that y'all engage with the world. Because when we went to New Orleans, my son had been there once with his mom when he was young. Now he's 21. We can go hang out. We can go drink. We can go to bars. I can show him around, show him how New Orleans works. Brought him to an underground metal show, blah, blah, blah. He's like, man, I've never experienced anything like this. And I'm like, dude, I've been doing shit like this since I was like 16. Like this is how I lived my teenage years, my young adult years. This is what we did. We went out, we drank, we ran the streets. And I've been, I mean, like I'm from the latchkey generation. We were out on the streets all day long as kids. So it's like there's this real disconnect with my generation and your generation. We're not just old men screaming at clouds, as some people want to think. We actually see this as a problem. There's something going on, and it feels like it's almost like a contagion.
Yeah, so there are several things there. A lot of has been made over the fact that Generation Z, isn't drinking, isn't having sex, or really isn't doing anything, right? Uh, and I think there are several things there. One, the internet is incredibly, incredibly isolating, right? So look, as is it's kind of like horribly common, it seems as if there's been, and I mean, very recently, before we started recording. Uh, Shooting in Minneapolis, right?
Hmm.
Uh, a shall we say new woman, right? At least in a legal sense, busts into a church, shoots it up. Uh, Obviously, a tragedy. The reason I bring that up, right, is that unusually, their manifesto, they were basically able to, everyone was able to get a copy of it before it got taken down, right, which is not always the case. And obviously, there's the what you would expect, the schizoid ramblings, the gender ideology, the hatred for God, right? That's there. But what's particularly interesting about it to me is that the whole thing is drenched in like schizophrenic internet memes, right? Like things like niche things, memes in Russian, all of these things. There's no real ideology in between them, right? Simultaneously, far left and far right politics kind of blended together, right? It is literally derangement by the internet. And there are a couple things there, right? Which is one, the internet is isolating because it takes up your time, right? You're not out there doing something, meeting someone face to face. Well, there's another facet of it as well, which is the internet has massively multiplied subcultures, right? So for instance, you consider the classic 80s high school movie tropes. You've got the goths, you've got the nerds, you've got the preps, and then the goths, right? Those are your four sort of houses, right? If it's Harry Potter. Well, okay, those are different cultures, right? But they're geographically contingent, right? Okay, sure, you can be the one goth kid at your high school, but it's not really much of a culture, is it? Right? That's just you being weird. But even those subcultures, right, that counterculture, to look at certain examples, was dependent on people being around you. Whereas now, and I mean, this conversation in itself is an example of that, right? You and I live 2,000 miles apart, right? But because we share certain reading history, certain view on politics in common, we can speak to one another. And this is a relatively healthy version of it, right? Whereas, the ability to find people who share your bizarre opinions or will radicalize you further in those opinions in, either kind of public facing social media or in, chat rooms, right? Or in, where a lot of these kind of troons come from, Discord, right? Is splintered that. So if you do have an event in your culture, right? Like let's say like a conference, some sort of meetup for fans of whatever you're into. Well, that community, as the gay internet term is not at all geographically, close to one another. You could be talking all day to a guy from, Edmonton, to a guy, on a military base in Japan, right? And there's cool things that happen with that. But one of the downsides is the physicality of culture goes away. I think another one, and you mentioned being the latchkey children, uh, and this is uh, particularly the case for sort of kids who are 10-ish years younger than me, because my parents are core Gen X, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Whereas for the kind of the last half of my generation, their parents are millennials. And so you see a shift, right? Latchkey kids parented in a different way than millennials did, right? The stereotype of the helicopter parent is very, very true. Say this is someone whose wife has worked as a teacher, right? She sees it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that has created kind of a simultaneous, on one hand, like bubble wrapping, right? Refusal to failure, a hyper focus on like achievement and like winning at everything. But also on the other end, no guards whatsoever on the internet, right? Something that is addictive, something that is, designed to kind of splinter you into these different things. And so like, here's an example, right? I went to private school, so it was kind of behind the curve on certain things, right? But, and actually I was just talking to Merrick, the good old boys, about this. Even something as simple as like getting into a fight at school, right? Not like a Roger Jackson style beatdown where someone who's in a coma, like a little dust up, whatever. Well, starting right around with No Child Left Behind, that was a mandatory suspension for both parties involved, right? Escalating very quickly. So instead of being like, all right, like don't do it, maybe the guy who started it gets a punishment, but still within the realm of like, you are still a normal student there. Well, all of a sudden that's been escalated, right? That's something that you can't do or you'll be expelled, right? Which is a very serious, very serious kind of punishment, right? Especially when you consider the the number of gates people are required to jump through, right? Where now it's like, and obviously it has changed with like certain economic data on, like the value of a college degree, but it is the baseline of graduating high school is not even close to enough, quote unquote, to live a decent life, right? Like if you want to be middle class, obviously this isn't 100% true, but this is the cultural narrative. You have to constantly be pushing through institutions, right? And you do that by effectively flopping over, doing exactly what they want, right? By jumping through all the hoops. And so you see that like the college degree of 2025 is basically a master's degree, right? Like you don't get the benefit, quote unquote, from simply a high school diploma or simply an undergrad degree. So there's an intense pressure, especially for middle class people, to lean into that, right? To be part of the institution. And so like I saw this in college, right? People who were very, very academically accomplished, but never did anything, right? All they did was, index with that system, because the competition, both internationally and domestic, for all of those decent jobs, for all those decent positions has gotten so high that even if you don't feel it, there is an external pressure, right? To focus on that exclusively. And I think, when you look at the combination of, the internet, this sort of like increased sort of outside pressure in education to, not to, kind of color within the lines. And you have this sort of, opiate of the masses, if you will, the internet. It's like, dude, it's not surprising nobody's doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
And one last point, and I'll throw it back to you because you've got me on a rant here. But one of the other features as well is that men and women have sort of split into separate cultures. One of the weird things, I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you go to like a lot of restaurants or bars, you'll notice that there are a large number of single women there, or single women in groups, with a relatively smaller proportion of men. And that's sort of a weird thing, right? You'd assume there'd be a parity, or if anything, there'd be more guys there than not, right? There's even a joke, right? When people talk about clubs, right? They'll let the women in and throw the guys out.
Mm-hmm.
But a large part of that is that, one, young men are retreating, right? They're staying indoors. They're staying, on the internet. I realize the irony of saying this. They're interacting with people socially, but through, kind of like group chats and gaming groups and stuff like that. And the political war between the sexes has turned up to such a degree that, men and women have become politically and culturally distinct, right? They see themselves as different classes. We can kind of put on a Marxian framework. And so, for instance, right, all of this kind of, extreme anti-male sentiment we definitely saw through, the Me Too era, but is still definitely around, has created the system of kind of mutual distrust and mutual hatred, where there are a lot of men who hate women in general. There are a lot of women who hate men in general, right? They view themselves as sort of opponent forces in the world. And you see this in political affiliation, right? Men are significantly to the right of women, right? Significantly more Republican, right? They identify with that as being the male thing to do. And so, again, right, like it's no shock that people are, lonely and isolated, because, even at the most basic level, which is like, well, why do you go out? Oh, you go out because, you want to meet a girl, you want to talk to someone. Well, a lot of guys just aren't going out at all. And at least some part of that is that there is the fear in the male mind of like, oh, if I go up and talk to her, am I going to get Me Too'd? Right? There's always that, like, this is a great example, right? You see this on social media all the time, where effectively there is sort of internet points to be won by exposing a creep. So the classic setup, and there have been dozens of versions of this, is, woman at a public gym, wearing something very revealing, with a sort of a hidden camera there to see all the guys who are, checking her out. One of the most egregious examples of this was a staged incident, right, where the woman did this knowingly to try and gather internet fame, where she had security cam footage of a guy sitting on a weight bench with his phone down by like in between his legs scrolling. And it looked like from a certain angle that he was looking at her, pleasuring himself. And she took that to the internet and said, look, I got him. I found a creep in public. Here's his name. It blew up. There was a lawsuit. He won that lawsuit because he didn't do anything wrong, of course. But that sort of asymmetrical relationship where, one, I feel as if I am aggrieved by women as a class. And also there's that in the back of your mind, like, if this goes wrong, I'm screwed. That's a part of it as well. And look, I say this as someone who's married, right? I'm out of that game, but I see it in my friends, I see it in my peers. And so, yeah, it's one of the, like, genuinely, if there are questions that need to be answered, one of the most basic is that men and women view each other as sort of oppositional groups, right? They have been transformed from merely kind of a broad category of humans into distinct political classes with opposing viewpoints. And I mean, you see that like Sneeko is a great example. Like Sneeko and Tate and all these guys are basically feminism for men, right? They're telling you, you personally, have been aggrieved by women. Women have treated you badly. Here's how you can sort of stick it to them. And in much the same way that I think feminism is an unhealthy way to view the world, that ideology is as well. But nonetheless, there's an audience for that, right? There are many people who feel as if women as a class have treated them poorly. And again, obviously, this is a very bad thing for a society, for a culture. One of the most basic things that, an organization or an organism rather, let alone, a political system needs to do is replicate, right? People need to be having children. And again, this bifurcation is very, very good for ensuring, ensuring political power for certain people, right? I'm sure you remember when, Roe versus Wade was struck down, or when any one of these things, that's kind of like a pitched battle in the war between the sexes, right? It's very, very good for, political power. It's good for riling people up, but it's massively destructive to culture. And so honestly, man, I think that's another part of the reason why, people aren't doing anything, because even the kind of like hedonism of another era, which necessarily wasn't the most healthy thing, but it was better than this. Like even, Dante recognizes this. We're in, the Inferno. He puts right after you go through limbo, right? It's lust and adultery. It's not good, right? It'll still damn you. But the idea is, well, you're doing it with someone else, right? There is sort of a cooperation in that, which is still wrong, but it is more social and more laudable in a way. Whereas, obviously, pride and wrath, which are kind of like singular, monofocal, right, are seen by Dante obviously as being worse. And so similarly, right, I don't think going back to, the kind of like hedonistic culture of our previous era is necessarily the best solution. But clearly what we have now is worse because people are massively isolated, both men and women, right? Obviously, incel is the term among men, these guys who are, permanently pissed off at women, needs, not in education, employment or training, very, very bitter and angry at the world. And that's a bad thing. But similarly, we've seen the rise of the femcel, right? The female version of the same thing, a slightly different phenomenon, right? But the numbers don't lie, right? People are not getting married. They're not forming pair bonds really at all. And one of the other parts of the internet that matters with this is, to be honest, right, sort of substitutes for relationships, right? Porn is a good example, but the recent birth of, AI chatbots. There's a subreddit, which I don't spend any time on Reddit, but I've seen screenshots from it, called My Digital Boyfriend, right? And it's all these lonely women falling in love with a chatbot because, again, it is a synthetic replacement for a real relationship. it's available whenever. It tells you exactly what you want. It mirrors you and strives to please you in sort of a similar way that an algorithm can find, exactly what combination of, stacked genitalia sort of stimulates your monkey brain. Like, it is replacing that social function. And look, man, like I'm not some, shrieking moral conservative, talking about like, oh, we got to ban this. The kids are, the kids are being victimized. But from a very genuine point of view, it's like, it is clear that there is a problem with the youth, right? Something is not working, because that most basic function of, pair bonding and reproducing, that has been interrupted. So I will also say, one of the, I think, the defining features of Generation Z is that we sort of bifurcated in the same way that millennials did, sort of in response to GWAT. And there's a very real difference between, the guys that signed up to go to the Sandbox Wars, and then, the slightly younger crowd who was at Occupy, right? They produced different cultures. Well, that has dramatically increased, particularly as, birth rates and religious attendance has declined and then flatlined, right? That you have these two cultures, right? One culture, which is very secular, has very few children. And then the other culture, right? Which is, more religious, generally speaking, more conservative and having more children. And particularly you saw this in a major way as regards COVID, right? So I was in college during COVID, which means I sort of got yanked out of my immediate social setting and kicked back to my hometown, right? Like I said, went to school, small school. So that became my new social group because everyone was in the same category. And what was particularly interesting about that is the trend lines between the people who went for COVID and who didn't are dramatically different. For instance, right, in my immediate social circle, I'm 26, and the vast majority are married, and we're sitting at about 50-50 on kids, right? Which is significantly under the average, right? Most people are having kids later than that. Most people are getting married much later than that. And so those two cultures have massively split, right? They're almost different organisms. Like, people I know who are still very, very worried about the coof. And it's like, well, we almost can't interact anymore. It's sort of like the time machine, right? We have like the is it the Elohim and the Morlocks? Elohim that's a biblical term. I can't remember what it means. The point is, the Eloi, that's what it was, and the Morlocks, right? Where they're sort of came from the same organization, but have become something different. And again, that is the split there as well. You could say it was COVID, but there's a bigger one, which is basically a split on gender politics, which is not even necessarily a split on left versus right gender politics, although that exists as well. But is that a game you are going to play, right? Are you going to enter into kind of the loser's game, right? Or are you going to, find some sort of, mutually beneficial arrangement where, you can live as normal? And so this has been a massive, probably 20-minute rant from me. But I think that is a major factor as well, kind of driving this alienation and loneliness.
So you mentioned a few things there, and one of the first things that you said that stuck out was when you were talking about the segments of society back whenever I was in high school, back in the 90s, right? You had your jocks, your preps, your stoners, your goths, and you had these segments, but then you had like I was kind of like a floater. I was like friends with a little bit of all of them and kind of floated around the groups. And that came partially because of the neighborhood I lived in was so there was like just outside of my neighborhood, there was a trailer park. And then there were really, really large, expensive houses in one area of the neighborhood. And then there were kind of the more moderate houses in another part of the neighborhood. And we were all kind of intermingled. And so you talk about how the internet's so bifurcated now, it doesn't feel like a person can intermingle through all these different things and find similarities with all of them. That you're kind of stuck in one chasm, so to speak, and that's just where you belong and that's it. And when you try to get out of there, they all hate you and then you're demonized, and then you're whipping around just trying to find something in common with another group. So you latch on, and sometimes you're latching on to really bad ideas in order to get that dopamine hit, I guess, from the internet, from the interactivity. When if you're out and let's just say you're eating at a restaurant, sitting at a bar at a restaurant, start talking to the guy next to you who's having a drink, maybe had a rough day, is waiting on a to-go order to bring food home to his wife or whatever. Like you're getting that interactivity, you're learning how to interact with people, and you're developing these social skills that you've kind of abandoned for the internet culture at large.
Yeah, definitely. So I shortly before he passed, had a very interesting conversation with Z-Man, right? Uh, and we were talking about generational politics. He was a Gen X guy. My parents are Gen X, and so I think that and this is something I talked with Buck Johnson about. There's sort of there's a good relationship between those generations. You see it in humor as
Mm.
well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Gen X and Gen Z humor is closely linked. Like there's a
Right.
certain amount of like sort of absurdism and like kind of sarcasm in both, which is why I mean, like the difference between someone like Sam
Over the
Hyde, who's very
top, a
popular,
little bit
yeah,
dark.
like Sam Hyde and Tom Green are not that different, right? If you
Right.
really
Yeah.
dig down into it. Uh, but one of the things he mentioned when I was talking to him is that he felt as if the Gen Z lacked a lot of common cultural knowledge. So one of the things he was saying was really different about growing up in a world with relatively limited media is that if something happened, a big movie came out or, that there was some big trial in the news, everyone knew about it, right? Everyone was following it. And so you could, relatively easily, strike up a conversation with someone and be on the same cultural footing. Like, oh,
Mhm.
did you see the game last night? Right? Classic water cooler stuff. Whereas he said that with his Gen Z employees, one of the things he was finding is that they didn't seem to know very much about most things, right? They didn't necessarily follow sports. They didn't follow, any number of things, but there would be, one or two areas where they were experts on, right? They'd really fallen down the rabbit hole. Uh, I'm probably guilty of that as well, right? Like I don't follow sports, I follow MMA, but if you want to talk to me about like, you know, some, esoteric production run of Toyota V8s, then I'm probably your guy, right? uh, and so I think that extremely specific subculture is a piece of that as well, because your cultural touchstones are specific to, that non-geographically contiguous 100 or couple thousand people who are interested in that same thing.
Mhm.
Uh, and there are pros and cons to that. I think one of the pros to that is that fundamentally our culture is sick, right? It is built upon a number of lies about human nature, lies about spirituality, lies about historical events. And so, at least from my perspective, right, those need to be addressed. Those need to be taken down. And that's a very difficult thing to do in a time of cultural consensus, right? I mean, look at, the pioneers in our tradition, right? The guys who had our sort of politics 50, 60 years ago were one, seen as cranks, and two, they couldn't get an audience, right? You were a big deal 30 years ago if you had a newsletter with 100 recipients.
Mhm.
Whereas now it's like 100 people on Substack. It's like, that's nothing. You can do that in
Mhm.
an afternoon if you write a good
Right.
essay or something. And obviously, if you were designing a time to live, you'd want to live in one with a strong culture and a strong cultural consensus. But the problem is, right, that splintering, obviously the internet exacerbated it, but it began a long time ago, right? The culture was fundamentally built on lies, right? Obviously, look, it couldn't even last 80 years before it started to fall apart, in the kind of post World War II consensus. But so it's sort of a bad thing, right? That cultural decay is real. It's sort of like chemotherapy, right? Where it's like you're making yourself sicker to hopefully make yourself better. And so in that environment where you have all these dozens of, extremely splintered both cultures and also narratives about the world. Because let's not forget, right, that everything has become political. And so, you have, all of these people who have wildly different views on, what is the correct way to organize a society. And there are pros and cons to that. Again, no one can agree on anything. That's not good. But also, if you are in the role of a dissident, if you are in the role of changing that cultural consensus, well, instead of fighting, an 800-pound gorilla, well, you're fighting I don't know, 80 chihuahuas, right? The sum total of mass might be the same, but it's fundamentally a different thing to do. Similarly, I think one of the interesting features of Gen Z, and this is another kind of interesting crossover, is that they tend to be very cynical about narratives in a way that the millennials were not, right? The millennials are big joiners. They're big activists. They see themselves as, the special kid who can change it all. Whereas, I think by virtue of being a smaller generation, but also by virtue of growing up in, as we hear in the Matrix, right, the desert of the real, right, this kind of ever-changing environment where narratives are always changing and be twisted to serve any purpose, that there's a weird postmodernism in both generations as well, right? Which, postmodernism is sort of a whipping boy for a certain strain of very gay conservatives who really like a certain country in the Middle East. But there's something there, right? And the cultural touchstones of your generation, right? I think of even people like, David Foster Wallace, or, I see you have House of Leaves on the shelf behind you, right? Those have become very popular among, the small fraction of people my age who read, because there is sort of a simpatico there. There's a recognition of oh, you too. And again, right, fundamentally, obviously politics has a sort of dollars and cents to it, right? There's an economy, but really, and we see this even in the rabid hatred for God that you see, among these kind of radical transgender terrorists, where it's this is a war of belief. It's a war of narrative. And as we've seen, the conservative types have had they've had the bar graphs, right? They've had the charts to say this is wrong. And did it work? No, they lost everything. And so I see, being a creature of narrative existing on the internet lends you to that sort of, mimetic or belief-based warfare that I think is actually the thing that is going to, or that stands a chance to sort of fix these problems. Because in a certain sense, if you were operating materialistically, you've already ceded that ground, right? You've ceded a premise that ultimately is your undoing. Whereas if your conclusion is basically, well, those are your facts, I don't care, this is wrong, right? I'm making a moral claim, something ultimately unprovable. That's a stronger position to argue from. And look, part of I think the reason that the right has, in a relative sense, succeeded compared to its previous performance for the last 80 years is effectively a realization that your moral standards do not apply to me, right? I think I might have even mentioned this last time we were speaking, but that moment where JD Vance says, I don't care, when, some horrible woman is whinging on about, a deported rapist or something.
Was it Martha Brenham or whatever?
Yeah, this is the second time I've referenced it and I didn't bother to check who it was. But the point is, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. I think that is something we are likely to see more of.
That goes back to what you were just saying about that meme culture, that meme that just kind of rides the wind. It doesn't matter if in probably 10 years, people will still be referring to that, but they won't be mentioning JD Vance at all. They'll just be like, I don't care, Martha. And people will understand what's being said.
Well, right. And another part of this as well, and I was actually just talking to my wife about this, because she witnessed a fascinating interaction between a very, I wouldn't say very progressive, but a millennial who is sort of owned by the progressive thought system, right? Very, very concerned about democracy and Nazis and, those sort of buzzwords, right? And she said it was a fascinating interaction because effectively this kid's 17 and, he's talking to the lady at the front desk, just, waiting for something to happen. They're making just idle conversation. He's like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to, take whatever government next year, right? I'm not going to take the civics class. And she flipped out, losing her mind. Like, oh, you gotta understand history because there are some people right now who think Hitler was right. The very like breathless,
Hmm.
uh, kind of, I guess, like moralistic tone that you see in a lot of progressive environments. And look, man, that is anathema to young people, particularly young men,
Hmm.
right? And being raised by that. And remember earlier, I said the attitude towards fighting in schools has broadly been applied to masculinity writ large. Right? That is extremely stigmatized. That is a bad thing. It's very much the kind of the sort of like F scale nonsense of like, if you do this, this, and this, you're basically a national socialist. Uh, that is producing a reaction. And the idea of this kind of like cyclical view where you have the scorned son come back. There is certainly an element of that as well, because one of the problems for our regime is that a large part of their success kind of, let's be honest, it came down to bribery, right? It was, well, don't rock the boat because your 401k is going up. You got a pretty cool RV, a Harley. You get to go on vacation a couple times a year. The stocks keep going up, and you have a decent job. And with each successive generation after the boomers, right, the proportion of success that each generation was able to reap diminished, right? If Gen X got 70% of the boomers, well, millennials got, let's just say, 70% of what Gen X did.
Hmm.
And now you're at the point where many people my age are operating under the assumption they will never own a house. They will never be able to reap the rewards of Social Security. And so that bribe, especially when you consider the sort of anti-white discrimination stuff, where I mean, look, man, like I many peers like this as well, basically went to a college 2 or 3 tiers down from what we should have, right? Based on the numbers. Like
Hmm.
I'm talking kids who are, captain of, multiple sports teams, student body president, all A's. And they're
Hmm.
going to schools that, they're not bad, but it's like third and second tier state schools because
Hmm.
it's the only thing that said yes. It's like, well, one, the rewards your bribe is decreasing. But on the other end, right? Well, is there even a bribe for me to take? Right? Is there a way I can index in the system? And honestly, I think that women are really only a half step behind in this. We saw this during 2020, right? That white women sort of were on the edge, right, about if they could be part of the Rainbow Coalition or not. White men cannot. I mean, honestly, many men cannot, regardless of kind of race. But that's producing a surplus of competent guys, right? Guys who should be, you know, in line for being a bank president or should be working at a company, who should be, integrating with society, who are locked out for any number of reasons. And they've been lectured their entire lives. They've been isolated either, by state decree, as we saw during COVID, by a hostile social environment or by themselves, right? Like there's certainly an amount of personal culpability in this too. And look, man, like those people are radicalizing quickly. I
Hmm.
mean, look, like I see this in my audience, which my audience tends to be a little older than I am. I think my average age of a viewer is like 34, right? Okay, fair enough. But like the number of young guys I know who are not explicitly political, don't really pay attention to the kind of nerdy stuff you and I do, but are saying very, very radical things about, shall we say, prominent 20th century events, right? Pick your poison. Or, infamous Austrian artists. Like, it's kind of nuts, right? It's crazy.
Hmm.
And part of, that kind of moral consensus that is dead and gone, but still kind of exists as a shambling husk, was that ability to make certain things sacred, that ability to say that's off limits. You can't joke about that. Uh, well, dude, that's gone. That's 100% gone. And
Hmm.
so that's what I think is exciting about this. And look, like it would be better if all of those, radical guys were in a society where they didn't have to be political, where they could just be normal Joes, working hard, kids at home, integrated into society, with a common interest in making things better. but that wasn't an option available to them, to be honest, in many cases. And so, yeah, I mean, I actually have a lot of hope for Gen Z, and that speciation I was talking about earlier with regards to COVID exists with politics as well, right? Uh, Gen Z has a very flat distribution curve, and they're well, actually not even a distribution curve. It's almost a like a letter W, right? There's almost no one in the middle, but there's a lot of lefties, and there's a lot of far right people. And one of the interesting things that I think has pushed especially many young men to the right is that what is the deal offered to them, right? If you are, a 20-year-old, white guy, you want to join the Democrat Party. Let's just use that as a stand-in for the political left. Well, who can you be like? I mean, do you want to be like that Harry Sisson guy? Like you want to be like him? Like, okay, maybe, you could be like Hassan Piker, but that's not
Well,
particularly attractive.
that's why they're all trying to go out and do these photo shoots where they're lifting weights.
Exactly. Like in a vain attempt to gather that.
Right.
But even then, right, you can join, but you have to apologize. You have to be deferent. You have to be, you have to, bite the pillow and take it, to be blunt. Or you cannot. And many young men, and particularly the kind you actually want, right, the driven types, the people who, feel an urge to change things, they're not taking that deal. And look, like, right-wing men do not a culture make in and of itself. But one of the other things that's been kind of interesting has been that as that consensus fell apart, a lot of culture is falling apart too. Uh, and particularly, you've seen this happen to feminism. Now, look, feminism still is a very real force in the world, but it's sort of embarrassed, right? No one, it's one of those things that, in the same way that, conservatives of a certain era felt like they couldn't actually say what they meant and felt like they had to couch it. You start to see the same thing with feminism, right? Particularly in the post Me Too era. And you see this in the way where it's like, well, I was exploited by men, but also women should be allowed to be exploited by men if they want, because that's their free choice, right? It's falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously minority, but one of the things that you do see is, and the problem with all of these subcultures I'm mentioning is they are by definition fractious. It's a small percentage of a small percentage, but the birth of the kind of like trad phenomenon, and also kind of a moving towards just kind of like general crunchy spirituality is very, very prominent among Gen Z women. And in general, a return to religion among Gen Z across like the entire Anglosphere, it seems like. There's still problems there, that kind of bifurcation between the sexes. Like, one, there are more men in church than women now, particularly young people, which is bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
That's not historically been the case. But also, you see a bifurcation by what sort of religion they're going to, or what sort of religious services, where women are tending towards more charismatic, more non-denominational institutions, whereas guys are going for very traditional ones. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Look at the birth of the tradcasts and the ortho bros, let alone what I've seen in kind of the conservative Protestant world. So yeah, that's sort of a scattered answer there, but I think that there is an immense amount of hope among Gen Z. Again, not everyone. This is a filtering mechanism to a certain degree, and a whole lot of people are getting filtered out. Right? They're becoming weird trannies. They're not reproducing at all. They're descending into the goon cave or whatever. But there's a whole lot of us who are relatively squared away, and I think that in the same way that 9/11 sent a lot of Gen Xers and millennials off the beaten path, right? That sort of woke them up to culture. COVID did the same thing, right? COVID, anything in 2020, right? That sort of series of black swan events radicalized a lot of people of every generation, but particularly young people, right? Because if you are in those kind of formative years as a teenager in your early 20s, or even younger, right, that's going to shift your view on things. So yeah.
Do you remember that article that came out I don't know, probably last year, I think it was. And it was the woman talking about how every time she found a man that was strong and charismatic and caring and successful, his politics turned out to be conservative. And so she had to break up with him, but she couldn't find any liberal men that she was attracted to. I've often wondered, do you think that begins to take a toll on women at large and begins to move them further right and further away from their kind of Karenisms or whatever? It's like there's this weird thing that started in 2015, 2014, where women became very condescending towards men and were like preachy, as you had said, like moralistic. And men just kind of like look at you and you're look at it and they're like, all right, what the fuck ever, man. It's like, and just go on about our business because we don't want anything to do with that.
Yeah. So honestly, man, I don't, I don't think so for a couple reasons. One, there is a very prominent cultural message that will explain that. And the answer is basically men writ large are a problem, right? Men need to be better. And I've seen this, right, in my own social circle. Progressive women who go through a series of relationships with progressive men and are badly treated, right? They have an axe to grind, right? They've been mistreated by these kind of, effeminate scum. Uh, but the problem is, right, that would require that sort of return to the right that you're talking about requires a certain amount of responsibility that I don't necessarily see as being super common uh, in that sex. I think that honestly, what the situation we're in is sort of a prisoner's dilemma, right?
Mm.
Where both men and women have the opportunity to screw each other over. With men, it's obvious, sleeping around, dating around. She gets 35, I'm out. You're wasting that woman's time. You're leaving her in a bad position because all of a sudden, she's been, dating a guy with no commitment for, her best years, and she becomes at the end of it one of these, aging single liberal women. And the way women can screw guys over is obvious as well, right? I mean, look at custody battles, the whole Me Too hammer, alimony, any of these things, right? Well, how do you get out of that, right? Well, there are sort of three end states, right? Which is either both people try to screw each other over, and at least they didn't get exclusively victimized, right? They're sort of like, well, at least I got my revenge or I got something out of it. Then there is the two situations where one party is acting honestly, the other one decides to screw them over, which is, advantageous for one, not for the other. Mm-hmm. Or there is effectively both parties have to enter into a situation where they can be victimized, but together they reach the maximal amount of shared utility, right? The guy gets a wife, the woman gets, a sense of security. And in a previous era, the ability of each party to screw each other over was radically decreased. There was a lot more, social stigma to divorce. There was a lot of social stigma around adultery. Being married was seen as sort of the default. But I mean, look, like if you were in charge of society, you could swap all the incentive structure around. Yeah, this problem could be fixed. But neither you nor I nor anyone listening to this, I assume, has the ability to do that. So you're sort of stuck in a bad situation. And I think that this is one of the problems that older people have talking to younger people. Whereas younger people are expressing systematic complaints, which are legitimate, right? It's very hard to find, a decent woman to date. It's very hard to, support a family. And older people are speaking from their experience, which was in a different cultural context, which is not necessarily super helpful, right? Which is we'll just go into the factory and shake the owner's hand and get a job, that style of advice, it does not apply. But the other thing, which does, is the individual advice, right? Within your limited situation, what should you do? And that quote unquote pull yourself up by the bootstraps is actually good advice for you personally, right? Not you as a class, not you as a member of a society, but you as an individual with finite resources. That is good
Just
advice.
strive for something. Strive to be better. Every day,
100%.
get better.
But the problem is, if you are at the same time as voicing that advice, saying like, oh, young people are so lazy, they're so stupid, they're, spending too much money on avocado toast, you haven't established the goodwill to say that, because it comes across as, especially when bundled with other attacks, as a condemnation, right? Kicking a guy while he's down. And so I think that that's part of the reason that traditional relationship is sort of broken down, because young people rightly feel aggrieved. And look, like, I was kind of lucky. I was able to sidestep a lot of dating. I've been with my wife for a very long time, even before we got married. So this isn't my experience, but my peers, I saw it happen. It's harder. It's really hard out there, right?
Yeah.
Because again, that bifurcation, right? Okay, let's say you're a young Christian man, religiously conservative. Well, just by virtue of the fact that that demographic trend I was talking about, where there are more men than women in religious institutions, period, but also the kind of divide as to what sort of religious community people are a part of. Well, if you're at a conservative religious institution, it's kind of a sausage fest, like there'll be couples there, and I speak to my own church as an example, there's probably like 20 single guys and like 4 single women.
Mm-hmm.
Very round numbers. They're more than that, but let's just go with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas, so what do you do there, right? You're in fierce competition, and not to be too disparaging, but generally speaking, if you are in a religious community where getting married in your early 20s is pretty normal. If you're a 30-year-old single woman, there's generally a reason for that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So like, that's a very real problem. And like, again, the effect of dating apps on sort of the sexual marketplace, if we can use that term, really cannot be overstated. Because look, like, I exclusively did analog dating, right? Just for a number of reasons. So like, I don't really have that experience, but like, the fact that you are being judged on, a split second, like left or right binary decision is not how, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, it's not how you actually meet someone, right? Like, there might be an initial, like, oh, she's cute, I'll go talk to her, but it's not a yes or no, right? On both ends of that, right? She might tell you to, hey, get lost or whatever, or hey, I have a boyfriend, but it's a little bit different. And similarly, that comes back to that political bifurcation I was talking to, where quite often on that initial dating app pass, if you look conservative, you look like a Republican. And look, I'm not someone who would self-describe as conservative or a Republican, but you know what I mean? If you smell like a right-wing person, that's an automatic no. So you're getting filtered at the front end, right? Because and this is one of the weird things about the internet and Generation Z, is that so many things have become political signifiers, right? Down to a very, very minute level. So like, I think I mentioned this last time, but like your vices, like, oh, weed is left coded, a vape is left coded, cigarettes are right wing, or Zins are right wing, whatever. And those are stupid examples, but it indicates like all of the tiny little things which are signifiers of, your political allegiance and are kind of a filtering mechanism. So yeah, it's like genuinely a very tough situation. I empathize for people a lot who are kind of stuck in it, because again, right, you're playing that prisoner's dilemma. You can be screwed, and you're basically looking for someone you can make that bet on, right? They won't screw me, at the same time as the other person has most likely had a lot of experiences of being screwed. And both of you have, these loud cultural narratives which say, don't play the game, or play with the intent to screw the other party over, right? Adopt the mentality of the kind of like girl boss, career climber, adopt the mentality of, the pickup artist. And so again, right, it's a genuinely tough, like nasty situation. And it's no shock that the kind of traditional, like social settings where men and women mingled have kind of fallen apart. right? Because both parties are looking at as not kind of a, a coming together, but as a exposure to the enemy, right? An opportunity to have your, your life ruined one way or the other. And so, yeah, it is both like a very like thorny, horrible issue, right? Like it's tough to solve on a, on a individual, let alone a social level, but also, like, generally speaking, I think that there is a lot of promise in Gen Z for the reasons I outlined earlier.
Well, I mean, there is good news too, because nearly 1 million men between Russia and Ukraine have been killed. So there are a lot of single women there. So the mail order bride market is prime for a comeback. So
It's true. I mean, jeez, yeah. Uh, Although I feel like we've learned from the boomers how mail order brides go, right? Like how many how many miserable boomers with some, like, Filipino mail order bride have you seen? There are dangers, but
um, oh shit, I had something else to say and then I just got sidetracked by that because I just had to say something sarcastic there. We've been too serious for too long. Um, oh, that's what, when it comes to expectation, I ran into this video. It was like, they do the YouTube shorts, and I ran into this video the other day, and it was like a man on the street interview, and he was like questioning these women about like their expectations of like their future husband or whatever. He was talking to this, and like it was almost every single one of them were just absurd. I remember one girl was like, "Yeah, I want my man to be over 6 foot tall, between 25 and 28 years old, making $400,000 a year." It's like, what are you talking about? Is this like normal? Like, is this like expectation of success normal? Where does this come from? Like, what is happening there? Because I've seen Andrew Wilson on the Whatever podcast. And I've seen some of his clips, and he argues with these women about stuff like that too. And I'm thinking, oh, this is just a one-off. And then I start seeing it pop up in different places. Maybe it's an algorithmic thing. I don't know, but it just seems like it's more prominent for women to have these unrealistic expectations of what you're going to find in a man, at young age. And maybe that's why you're single for so long. Maybe that's why you're not having children, is because you expect a man straight out of college to start making hundreds of $1,000s a year. That's just not realistic.
yeah. So there are several things there. One, I would caution anyone for watching those videos because it's like Jezebel for men, right? It's like outrage porn, right? Like the
I thought
narrative
it,
that, like,
I thought it was comedy at first. I didn't realize
oh,
it was
I mean, it
serious.
is comedic, right?
I went through six
But
videos before I realized it was real.
fair, fair. Uh, but it does sort of, it does sort of play into a narrative. And let's be honest, like it's partially true. Now, a facet of this, and the jokes write themselves, women can't count, like not in the way that men do, right? So like when she says 6 feet tall and $400,000, what she basically means is attractive and has money, right? Like the specific numbers, like these are absurd, right? Clearly.
Hmm.
And let's also be honest, how many women that who, said they wanted certain things and ended up with a guy who was different, right? That's a very common thing. Like look at the gap between romance novel covers and the guys these women end up with, right? There's a difference there. But again, there is some truth to this. And part of it is social media, right? Social media feeding you sort of a curated version of what normal is, right? Like feeding you this kind of like life of luxury and presenting that as normal, right? You see it all the time. So that's what most people should live like. I mean, and another part of this, right, is that women naturally, not in all cases, tend to want a mate that is above them in social status, right? They tend to want a man who is, smarter, wealthier, than they are, right? Where men don't quite work the same way. We don't care, right? We're like, all right, she's hot, but she makes $30,000 a year, whatever, I don't care. And so part of the problem of women entering the workplace, women being overrepresented in higher education and consequently higher overrepresented in professional fields, is that you have women that are kind of locked out of, just by virtue of numbers, men who were above them in earning power and social standing. So for instance, right, if you were a female physician, well, unless you got married while you were into another doctor, well, you're in your mid 30s, you are making a lot of money. And so you're trying to attract a vanishingly small pool of highly competent men as someone who's, to be honest, aging, right? Not old, but past the point where a guy who makes $2 million a year, he doesn't have to date 35-year-olds unless he wants to, right? And so, I'm not saying that to like revel in these women, in their tough situation, because from a genetic perspective, that instinct makes a lot of sense, right? It's very expensive on both a biological and a social level to have a kid with someone. And you don't want to waste that shot on some bum, some loser, some guy who can't take care of you when you're, unable to work for, a year or so, right? So that makes sense. And I get it. And maybe I'm too sexist to blame women for this. Just from like, if you see what I'm saying there, right? But you sort of have to feel for these women because they have done exactly what they were told to do, right? They were told to achieve. They were told to follow the trail of breadcrumbs. Like that's what you should do to be a capital W woman, right? Woman is a political identity, not merely as kind of a sexual descriptor. And on the other end of it, they've bought in, right? They're hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. They do have these skills, but that has massively handicapped them on a biological level. And it doesn't just have to be doctors, right? You see the same thing with, women going for master's degrees or women who have these professional credentials, right? You look at, higher education's now roughly 60-40 female to male. So, even if every one of those women gets married to someone they went to college with, which obviously doesn't happen, but let's just say that leaves you a large portion, right? Roughly 1 in 3 who are hosts, right? Who are looking for, someone of, high social status. And consequently on the bottom, you have guys who are in many cases making good money, but are, they're electricians, they're guys with trades. And that's socially, unfortunately, looked down on, right? That's even aside from the dollars and cents of it, right? I had to pay a plumber, and if that's his hourly rate, like that dude's doing real well.
They do okay.
But, yeah, dude, I hate plumbers. I mean, this guy saved my life, but like highway robbery. But in all seriousness, right? Like that is a major issue because again, right, that social stigma, those social signifiers are very, very important to women. They're important to everyone, but that makes pair bonding really difficult. And again, when we're talking about the difference between like individual advice and social advice, like you hear a lot of our guys saying, hey, get in the trades. And that's good advice, right? It's a great way to make money. It's a great way to build an asset that is yours. But there is a consequence to that, which is you are disadvantaging yourself from a certain perspective in the dating market. And obviously we're talking in wide swaths. There are women who don't care about that. There are plenty of girls who, don't go to college. Like this isn't a death sentence by any means.
Yeah.
But when we're talking on a population level, that's creating a problem, right? That's creating a situation where, especially when we talk about that filtering out where, competent white guys are discouraged or blocked from entering these institutions anyway. Right now, you've got a bunch of smart guys who are, locked out of that system, and they're in a more sane society who would be their peers, right? Their dating pool are looking down their nose and saying, well, I've got a master's degree. You're a plumber. Why would I go out with you? And so like, is that women's fault? No, like they didn't like that, the girl she didn't have any power. She didn't do this, but nonetheless, it's creating that problem, right? It's creating this massive tension between the two sexes. And look, like men do lead a culture, right? Where that in time will produce, women flocking to them. But again, right, if that takes 20 years, that doesn't really help you very much if you're 45, right?
Hmm.
Because you can't really wait, let alone if you're a woman with a relatively, narrow, fertility band. And so, like, that's again where it's like the advice you give to an individual person sounds like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, because within the limited amount of resources you have, that is the best advice. And to my point about like the sort of like feminism for men, uh, that's a hard sell, right? Because like, let's be honest, it is hard, right? It sucks and it's not fair. But who's going to make it fairer, right? Like there's no immediate option for that to happen. And so your two options are basically like sit sit out the game, right? Just fold your cards and say like, all right, I'll just wait for something better to happen. Or it's to take the admittedly, shitty hand you've been dealt and say like, all right, like let's make a run of it. And I realize that's not a particularly like sellable option, right? That doesn't make me feel good to say it. I wish there was another like secret third way. But unfortunately, right, like fundamentally, we exist in the world as it is. And was it messed up? Is it messed up? 100% it is. Like it sucks. Like it's really a shitty situation. But ultimately, right, like you got to play the game. You've got to be an active member of society, and just waiting for things to shift. It's like the old line about the market, right? Like the market can remain irrational way longer than you can remain solvent.
Hmm.
Like at a certain point, it's like you have to make a move, right? And I understand why guys are checking out, right? I understand why guys are just, retreating, right? Not going out, not doing anything. It is it makes sense from a certain perspective, but you're forfeiting, right? You are forfeiting on a genetic level, right? You will not propagate. You are forfeiting on a cultural level. And if there is going to be wide scale change, you can't forfeit, right? And I do get a lot of pushback, from younger guys, guys who are having a tough time with these kind of remarks. They'll say like, oh, you had XYZ advantage, you married your high school sweetheart, why are you telling me what to do? I didn't have that option. And dude, that's true. Fair enough. I got lucky. I got a better hand. But that doesn't change the accuracy of what I'm saying, right? It doesn't change the fact that that is, given the constraints we're in, the best available option. And yeah, honestly, I think another reason that our enemies are ultimately doomed is that they have failed to give, young guys a reason to care about the system. That bribery that we're talking about, that bribery of, a nice, decent living, a family life. Well, look, like if you've got a lot of young, angry men, many of whom, let's be honest, are sort of pacified, right, by other things, the goon cave in Fortnite or whatever. But I mean, that's a recipe for social change. And so, like, to be honest, man, like, unless they can figure out a way to keep these guys on the plantation, they're screwed. It's simply a waiting game from that perspective.
Well, and this is probably going to make me unpopular with a certain segment of people, but men have responsibilities. Women have desires, men have responsibilities. That's just the way it goes. Women want things, men do what they can to bring those things to fruition for their women. That's the way the world works. That's the way the life's always worked. Men go out and fight the world wars. Men are the ones out there doing the dangerous jobs. They're the ones working as linemen. They're the ones that are being plumbers. They're the ones that are being electricians. Men have responsibilities, and we don't have the benefit of worrying about what women are doing. That's just not, it's not who we are. And you're never going to like satisfy your own masculinity and your own manhood by sitting around twiddling your thumbs, worried about the societal norms of women and how that you're going to get back at them or make them pay because you hurt. No, I, like you, married my high school sweetheart. When I was in the military, she divorced me. I got out of the military, I got married again. The woman cheated on me probably 8, 9, 10 times. I don't know, dozens of times. We ended up getting divorced too. I met my third wife online. She lived in South Africa. We weren't planning on getting together. It just kind of happened. But at no point in time was I chasing a woman around trying to make things happen or make things work or make that's not your job. Like your job is to work and to provide and to do the best you can and to create a life for your children, for your grandchildren, and for your spouse. And if they choose to be unfaithful or they choose to fuck you over, you don't have time to sit around and cry. Sorry, your Wheaties are getting soggy. Eat them, get back to work. You don't have time. That's just not, we don't have that luxury. That is not a man's luxury. That is a woman's luxury. Men have things to do and have things to accomplish. And if you're sitting around and you're wallowing in your sorrow, you're going to be miserable.
No, dude, you're 100% correct. I think that there's another layer to this as well, which is the hatred that a lot of young guys have for the kind of progressive new male types. And a large part of that is basically like, oh, I see the game you're playing, right? You're, mouthing all of these progressive platitudes to get women, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's why.
Yeah.
And it's especially frustrating because so many of these guys very clearly could not compete without that. Like these guys are not impressive. They're losers. I can think of one guy who is, a sort of a particularly ineffectual like coke dealer and like prog rock bassist. Like every single stereotype you can imagine put together. Like little wrists, soft hands, the whole thing. And but the game that he played, right, was, I mean, look, the drugs help, right? But it was the progressive politics. They're like, oh, babe, like I respect you.
Mm.
Like you're a proud, powerful woman.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's almost gross to even say it as a joke, right? You're like, geez, but that's a guy who had no male friends, right?
Yeah.
Every guy was like, have some respect for yourself, please.
Right. Right.
And ultimately, look, like women are the sexual selector, right? There's always, that is obvious. Generally it's the guy asking the woman out and being told either yes or no, right? It's just kind of a fact of, biological life. But also, like, sure, like there's all of this political filtering we're talking about. But one, as we've said earlier, the difference between what women say they want and what they actually want, is anyone who's ever been in a relationship would know those are different buckets, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yeah.
stated and revealed preference. And again, right, when we're talking about, this kind of like social status, there are multiple parts to that, right? A large part of it is basically like, have you built or done something impressive, right? Are you passionate about something is kind of a cliche, but it exists for a reason, right? Like is there something that you are capable and competent in? And so, when I look at like right-wing organizations, like what I'm a part of, there are a lot of guys there who it's like, yeah, sure, they haven't historically had a lot of success with women for any number of reasons. But it's like, okay, this is someone who's in a leadership role, right? They're doing something, they're building something, they're competent and capable. It's like, okay, like maybe you're the kind of guy that like was a late bloomer, right? Your 20s are a little bit rough, you get your feet under you, but you do real well in your 30s, right? Guys like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a large part of that is that, you're more confident, you're more capable, you have done things. And like, it's why the advice is so often like, go to the gym. It's not literally a physical thing, right? It's not literally like, oh, if you're jacked and you have a 6-pack abs, you'll, immediately find a girlfriend. Oh, it doesn't hurt, but it is a certain aspect of like dedication and confidence, right? You were, hardening your mind as well as your body. Like, okay, you were doing something that requires dedication. And so even if, there's no direct benefit, right? It's not the physique, it's not whatever, but it is that sort of like you are the type of guy who is, has dedication, who has, a certain amount of mental fortitude. And that's attractive in and of itself, both to men and women alike. And so even, right, like part of the problem of the death of these like social intermediary institutions, right? And oh damn, what's the guy who wrote Bowling Alone? Right, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a good book. Right, talks about the death of these institutions, because like look at something like even like a bowling league, right? Okay, are women lining up for championship bowlers? Probably not. I don't know. So it's not like the act in and of itself, but one, it's a way to meet people, and it's also a certain social institution where you can become a leader in that. You are looked up to even in that setting. That is attractive again, both to men and women. And so I think a big part of this is that kind of like loneliness epidemic writ large, which is people are not indexing with other people face to face, right? They're not a part of things. They're not joining things. And, those provide the opportunity to sort of show yourself off, right? That provide the opportunity for someone to look at you and say like, oh, like that's a capable person, right? That's a competent person. That's someone who is seen by their peers as being high status, right? And that status thing that we're talking about that's often conveyed by a job or by something else, like that's another version of it, right? Like that's another way in which you are someone who is looked up to, which is, let's be honest, like a huge part of it. And I look, man, like I've even noticed this kind of like, I guess like lack of social participation. Cause I like hosting parties, right? I like having people over. It's fun.
Mm.
And one of the weirdest comments I've gotten is like, oh, I didn't know people still did that. Or, oh, I've never been to a party before. It's weird, right?
Mm-hmm.
For people who are, my age. And it is artificial, right? You have to try and do it. It's not like there are just a bunch of events around. But in doing that, right, you're creating an opportunity for that. And again, I realize that's like pick yourself up by your bootstraps advice, but nonetheless, right? Like ultimately, if we are going to get out of this trap, right, this kind of like bifurcated prisoner's dilemma, well, someone has to act. That's the only way out of this. And to your point about like, there's no like punishing women or winning against women. It's like, okay, let's say you win the gender war, right? Do you put the women in camps? Do you like force them to admit they were like, what does this fundamentally mean? Right? Like other than kind of self-gratification, where does this get us? Because again, right, like we are a species that needs to exist. We are a culture that needs to exist.
Chain them in the basement and bring them out when you need a sandwich.
All right. Fair enough. This idea that you're presenting to me, that's some promise.
Just to push back on your bowling angle, Bill Murray in Kingpin had groupies. I clearly remember him signing boobs.
Citation, Bill Murray.
So my son that's 21 that I went to New Orleans with, he's working as an electrician's assistant. He got a job as an apprentice when he was 19 and he fell in love with it immediately. He liked it. He was like, I don't want to go to college. I'm tired of school. It's not for me. I enjoy this. And it's funny because we were talking earlier about how Gen X and millennials both parent Gen Z, but we raise our children differently. And I can clearly remember him not wanting to go outside and play and wanting to sit and play on the PlayStation or play, Xbox or whatever. And I'd be like, get out. Just get out of the damn house. You're going to go ride your bike. You're going to go do something. And now he loves physical labor. He's in love with it. Well, he's 21 years old. So in 4 years, he'll be a journeyman. By the time he's 31, 10 years down the road, he'll be a master electrician capable of starting his own company, running his own, contracting his own contractors out. And I'm like, look, dude, I know that you've never had like, not that he hasn't had luck with women, but he's never really had a close relationship with any of the girls that, have been in his life. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes you just don't run into that one person that you just really click with. And he's like, I thought there was this one girl I might date at some point, and then, we just stopped talking. We kind of faded away, stopped talking, and it just never happened. I'm like, all right, that's fine. I was like, but if you go out there and you successfully get your journeyman's license by the time you're 25 years old, become a master electrician by the time you're 31, 32 years old, start your own company by the time you're 35. Dude, trust me, you build it, they will come. You're not going to have to worry about it. Like you won't have to think about it, you know? And that's something that men need to understand, that it's not, you don't like growing up. The only thing I wanted, my mom always told me, she's like, ever since you were a little kid, you always wanted to be a husband and a father. Like that was just something that was in me that I really desired. And so it was very important that I become a husband and a father. And, like the first time that was taken away from me when I was in the military and it was just like ripped from me, I had three kids with my first wife, and just not being that constant pivotal part in those children's lives anymore, just due to circumstances. It was very painful. It was very hard to deal with. But, I sucked it up, kept working, did the best I could, and that's all I could do, you know? And there's some strain in some of those relationships today, but, those are my kids. They're always going to be my kids. And, if they ever need anything, they can always reach out to me. And that's just the way I am about it. But one thing I figured out along the way is if I'm always improving, if I'm always moving forward, if I'm always building bigger and better life for myself and for my future kids instead of what's right directly in front of me today, then that relationship will come to me. I will, you almost become a magnet to it. It's like unavoidable. You eventually, that success will be reaped back into your life for what you're putting out into the world. And so that's basically what I told my son. I was like, don't focus on it. Don't dread on it. Don't worry about it. It will happen. You'll get there. And that's what men need to, we all need to learn a little bit more patience, especially in modern society where everything is instantaneous.
Well, and to that point, right? Like women can smell desperation, you know?
Mm,
Like it's almost like if you want it too bad, you're
mm,
screwed. Like
yeah.
from the get-go. And it's actually funny, I think part of the reason I had, what success with women that I did is that I maybe just due to like neurochemical or whatever imbalances, just genuinely didn't care in a
Mm,
lot of situations.
right.
Whereas like I was not assuming that this was even a possibility of us ever going out
Yeah.
and just like not interested, whatever. And I'd realized, halfway through the conversation that that sort of indifference is it's the like I can't have it, so I want it thing.
Mm,
And that's not to say to be, some sort of like unavailable psychopath, but it is to say like there is a sense in which like by grasping too firmly at something, by going too hard, by being desperate, you sort of never get it. Uh, you drive it away, and that may sound a little like woo woo, kind of motivational speaker stuff, but it's really not. It's true, right? And I think that that is, one of the problems. I can't remember if it's the incels or the pickup artist community came up with this term. It's a good one, right? They call it like one-itis, right? Which is like constantly being obsessed with like the one that got away, right? To the
mm,
point where it kind of rules your life. And like, look, man, that sucks, right? Like lost love is, a very powerful thing. There've been, songs, books, poems written about it. But at the same time, that kind of like constant pining or desire or desperation, it can rule you in a way that's not particularly helpful. And yeah, I don't know. It's sort of a scattered response, but I think that that's a relevant feature of it as well.
yeah. I used to always joke that I'd never been on a date because, like, I would be hanging out with a girl for 6 months and then realize, oh shit, we're dating. Like it was just like never a conscious thing. It was always just kind of like something that occurred. And so, yeah, I think that's very important for young men to learn is like just kind of chill, man. It'll come. You'll get it. You know, there's always going to be one. Trust me. I know some real slobs out there that have no business with women, and they pull ass. You'll figure it out. So, well, man, I think we're gonna cut that. there. That's yeah, it's been over an hour. Shit. I didn't realize it'd
Yeah,
been
thanks,
so
man.
long.
Sorry, you got me on a tear. I
No,
feel
that's
like I
okay.
bad etiquette to just talk for 20 minutes unbroken.
No, I asked you on so you could talk and I could listen. I might have learned something.
Fair enough, dude. It's always funny, right? Because when you've been in this game long enough, you get the like the hey man, someone dropped out, I need a guest sort of texts and emails.
Hmm.
And I'm always happy to do it, but I realize that a big part of that is if you need someone to fill air, I'll fill air. Right. I can talk. But yeah, man, this was a ton of fun, dude. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, plug away, man. Plug everything you got going on.
Yeah, sure thing. So my primary output is the Jay Burden Show. You can find on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. It's an interview show, right? Normally a little bit less of me speaking than normal, but talk to a lot of our mutual friends. Tommy, you helped me out contacting Scott Horton. He and I did an episode that was pretty good, if I do say so myself. A lot of other people you'll know, but yeah, you can find my podcast on any platform you want to listen to it.
You just had one of my best friends on the other day, Gord McGill.
Yeah, he's a great dude, man.
I love Gord.
Uh,
We're both truck
yeah,
drivers, so we connected very early on.
he's one of those guys that I can't believe I didn't talk to earlier because I'm a huge fan of his appearance on the Good Old Boys. Right, he's been on a number of
Mm.
times, and those I love that show, and his episodes are great. Like I feel like I could just listen to him all day.
Yep.
He's so entertaining, and he's fighting the good fight, and yeah, it seems as if there's been some positive development on the illegal alien truckers thing, which look, obviously it's not everything we wanted, but it's a hell of a start.
Hmm.
And it sort of seems like what happened with Boeing, right? Where once a few news stories came out, people started looking for them and realized this happens a whole lot more than anyone realized. I mean, there was just a case in Canada, right? Very similar of a turban wearing recent arrival, plowing into a family minivan and killing two people. And it's just one of those things where it's like, I don't know anything about trucking at all. But even from that perspective, you're like, this doesn't make sense. This is so stupid. We should fix this.
Right.
And yeah, it seems like Gord was pretty successful in getting that message out there and conveying it pretty well. So yeah, man, this is supposed to be my shilling, but I'll shill Gord too because he does good work.
Gord's awesome. So, all right, man. I'm going to stop the recording if I can find my damn mouse. There it is.